In prehistoric times, the ancestors of what would become modern day Europeans and East Asians would migrate into the endless grasslands of Central Asia. And for a while, the Eurasian steppe would connect everywhere, from Hungary and Central Europe all the way to Manchuria and China, kind of like an ancient mega highway. These people may or may not have lived in peace and harmony, but then everything changed when the Ice Nation when the last glacial maximum attacked. Basically, the Eurasian version of when Game of Thrones went downhill. Winter came and it never really left. This turned Central Asia into an inhospitable frozen wasteland, separating these people for millennia as they looked for refuge on the western and eastern fringes of Eurasia, leading to the development of the ethnicities that we see in Europe and East Asia today. Eventually, those Western Eurasians would disperse across the rest of the continent, dominating not only Central Asia, but also parts of the Middle East and India as well. Welcome to Little Known History, and today we will be unraveling the tale of the Indo-Europeans. So, if you have any interest at all in migrations, empires, and the beautiful tapestry that is human civilization, then stay tuned to the end of the video. If you want to discover the single greatest and not widely discussed enough ancient Indo-Aryan civilization. Proto-Indo-Europeans arose out of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. For those of you that didn't care at all in your high school geography class, that's basically Ukraine and southern Russia. Groups like the Srednyi and the Kavalinisk would domesticate horses, milk animals, which would lead eventually to lactose tolerance, which was kind of like an ancient superpower back in those times, and they would make wheeled carts. But then, one day, some unnamed genius or set of geniuses decided to attach the horses to the wheeled carts to invent the chariot. And so the invasion of the world began. Basically, this was the Bronze Age version of downloading tanks in a DLC pack. The Yamnaya culture would eventually emerge out of the Pontic-Caspian steppe and migrate west into the thick, dark forests of Europe, where they would encounter two kinds of cultures, hunter-gatherers and Neolithic farmers. Before they did the historic fusion dance to create modern-day Europeans, that suspiciously did not include most Northern European males for totally non-violent reasons. These groups all had distinct looks and features to them. The hunter-gatherers in places like modern-day Britain, France, or Germany had dark skin and light, sometimes even blue eyes, while the ones in Eastern Europe and Russia were lighter skinned and had darker eyes. The Neolithic farmers who had originated in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, were generally light-skinned with dark hair and brown eyes, although some of them, like the famous Otzi the Iceman, may have had darker skin than modern Spaniards, Italians, and Greeks. The Yamnaya themselves, who arrived during the Bronze Age, were tall, light-skinned, jacked, and had brown hair and brown eyes, and some of them may or may not have carried a gene mutation for blonde hair. That they inherited from the ancient Northern Eurasians way further back in time. So yeah, if you imagine early Europe, it was kind of like the original character creation screen in Skyrim. Lots of sliders for skin, hair, and eye color before someone eventually hit randomize. A vast Central Asian steppe where you could ride your horse chasing the horizon and think the earth was endless. There were cultures like the Andronovo who reached out further and further to the east and to the south. These were people who excelled in making bronze weapons and tools, riding horses, and the ultimate combination of the two, chariot warfare. Their descendants would include the Sarmatians and the much more famous Scythians. Further to the east, in modern-day Xinjiang, where the Uyghur Muslims in modern-day China live, came the Afana Sievo and the later Tokharians, who, according to some sources, taught the Chinese chariot warfare the hard way through raiding, as well as a little bit of trading as well. If you didn't know, Tokharians, much like ancient Egyptians, had a culture of mummification. In Central Asia, there was the Oxus civilization, who had impressive urban centers like Göbekli Tepe and Togoluk, advanced irrigation systems for cultivating wheat and barley, and maybe even their own writing systems. We don't know. The interaction between the two groups would even influence the development of Zoroastrianism, which would become the religion that would dominate in the subsequent classical Persian empires, like the Achaemenids, the Parthians, who aren't really Persian, and the Sassanids, particularly in their water and fire rituals, since temples in Göbekli Tepe had both water basins as well as fireplaces. They had entire temples dedicated to this intoxicating drink called palma, which was drunk by the priestly class or the Magi in Zoroastrian Persia, and it was said to give them visions. This drink was also mentioned in the Vedic texts as soma. Actually, there are a lot of other really interesting connections between Zoroastrianism in Persia and the Vedic religions that we now collectively refer to as Hinduism in India, like how both the Zoroastrian Avestan text and the Hindu Rigveda texts share a common ancestor in the traditions of the Proto-Indo-Iranians. Actually, you know what? Let's switch gears from little known history to little known theology, because the connections in the religion and mythology across Europe, the Middle East, and India is actually wild. Across Indo-European religions, there is actually a general trope of a thunder deity fighting a chaos serpent in order to bring back fertility and prosperity for the people, while using a signature iconic weapon. It's basically the shared Indo-European cinematic universe. Same repetitive plotline, just different weapons and different characters. In Norse mythology, Thor, using Mjolnir, fights Jormungand, the Midgard servants. Weirdly enough, a child of Loki during Ragnarok. No, not that Ragnarok, this one. Then there's Indra, who you might not know, and Zeus, who you definitely know, who were both considered the kings of the gods at certain points and fought monsters using lightning bolts to bring order against chaotic monsters. Zeus fought Typhon, who had one human head and many animal heads like lions, bears, and wolves. This was Zeus's last challenge after defeating the giants to gain supreme power for him and his siblings. On the other hand, Indra, using his Vajra lightning bolt, defeated the dragon Vritra to release the earth's stolen water. Quick breather. If you are liking the video so far, why don't you literally like the video, as well as subscribe to my channel? Every single one of you could help out my channel so much, and it's free to do so, so why not? Anyway, back to history. The groups that would become the ancestors of the Medes, Parthians, and Persians would migrate into what is now Greater Iran around 4,000 years ago, where they would encounter the Elamites, an advanced civilization that were basically the Sasuke to Mesopotamia's Naruto for thousands of years. Think Apple versus Microsoft, but with ziggurats instead of software. The Elamites and the surrounding Iranian Neolithic farmers do not neatly fit into the categories of black or white, and their skin tone has been described as upper mid-skinned, so basically something like modern Turks, Greeks, and Egyptians. The Indo-Aryans, who split off, moved into Greater India, mixing with the Harappan civilization as they crossed into the Indus River Valley. The Harappans had their own gridded cities, indoor plumbing, and weights and measures for trade, as well as their own yet-to-be-deciphered writing system. Man, wouldn't it be so convenient if we had something like the Rosetta Stone, but for their writing system? Where's Indiana Jones when you need him? Anyway, it's somewhat likely that the Harappans were Dravidians, who are a population that is still dominant in the southern part of India today. There was a southern branch of Indo-European migrations as well, where we get groups like the Armenians and Georgians from. One of these groups settled in Anatolia and became the Hittites, introducing chariot warfare to the greater Near East, and becoming a major power during the Bronze Age, along with the Egyptians, Assyrians, Babylonians, as well as the Mycenaeans and Minoans, who would eventually become the classical Greeks that we learn about in school today. Pay attention because they're going to be important later on in the video. The Hittites would be the first to write an Indo-European language down, and they were the first major civilization descended from those lactose-tolerant horsemen from the beginning of the video. It might seem like it was always obvious that the Proto-Indo-Europeans and their descendants would become superpowers like the Spanish, French, British, or Dutch empires, but at the beginning of written history, which was a little bit before they started migrating, there were the Sumerians and the Semites in the Fertile Crescent, the Dravidians of the Indus Valley, the Kushitics of the Egypt and Nubia, the Nordachiko of the South American Andes, and the Oxus of Central Asia, who all beat the Indo-Europeans to the metaphorical race of advanced civilization. However, the script would get completely flipped over 1,000 years later, thanks to the actions of three great men. First of all, Cyrus the Great, who united the Medes and Persians to form the Achaemenid Empire, which would stretch from the Balkans and Egypt in the west all the way to the Indus River in the east. Later on, the second great man, Chandragupta Maurya, would unite most of India, leading to what I would refer to as the subcontinent's first golden age. Around the same time, Alexander the Great would complete his conquest of the Achaemenids once he reached the Indus River, and though he and his empire would both soon perish, his legacy would include pushing Hellenistic culture into the region. One kingdom in particular, descended from his conquests, had the legacies of Zoroastrian Persia, classical Greece, and an India that was leaning towards Buddhism under Asoka the Great, known as the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom around modern-day Afghanistan, where you could see Greek coinage, Zoroastrian temples, and Buddhist stupas all on the same day, like a cultural Comic-Con. This was the culmination of thousands of years of Indo-European civilization, all in one place. However, they wouldn't stay on top forever. If you learned anything new at all from this video, be sure to like, share, subscribe to see next from my channel. This is Little Known History, signing out.